Welcome to creating animated storyboards for interactivity with Cinema 4D and After Effects. In this series of tutorials, we're going to be going from a series of static storyboards to a fully rendered animation that shows the interactivity that's built into an interactive module. So these static storyboards provide a good overview of how an app or an interactive module will function, but an animated version leaves no room for ambiguity, and it gives a client or an audience exactly the look, behavior, and functionality that you want. And you can do this relatively quickly before you start actually programming the interface. In this tutorial, we're going to be translating these storyboards into an animated version with Cinema 4D and After Effects. So we're going to be going from this series of drawings to this finished animation. So let's jump right into Cinema 4D and get started on the 3D aspect of this animation. I've included in the description a link to a place where you can download all the assets, so you can open up this file called instrument viewer start.c4d. So this is our 3D scene, and what I've got here is a few objects: beaker with fluid in it, scalpel with a handle and blade, and forceps, just simple surgical or laboratory items. We have an infinite floor that will provide us a background for the render. We have a sky which is currently turned off, but if we turn it on by alt-clicking on the red buttons there, we have an HDRI image that will give us some nice illumination. Although for now we'll turn it off. We have a key light, spotlight, that will give us some nice illumination. And finally we have a render cam that we're going to use to render out our scene. So if we click this box to look through that camera, we can see we've got a nice view of the beaker and the instruments. Now, in terms of rendering, I've set up a couple of different render settings. We have a quick render, which will give us a faster render. We have reflection or refraction turned off. We have ambient occlusion turned off, and our anti-aliasing is set to geometry. So if we do, let's just do a quick test render here. So what we have is a pretty clean, simple interface. So let's just jump back into the storyboard and take a look at exactly what we want to do here in Cinema 4D. So we have this little instrument viewer interactive module where a user is faced with a home page. They click start, and then they see a beaker that is empty. We also have a button that says instruments, and when they click on the instruments, the beaker rotates, or the camera rotates around the beaker, and these forceps and scalpel start fading into view. And then we have the final scene with the forceps and scalpel fully opaque. We have a couple of labels to label them in the beaker. So in terms of the 3D elements, we're really talking about the beaker, the scalpel, and the forceps, and their position and transparency in the scene. So if we take a look at this scene here, we're really looking at the end frame. If I bring back the storyboard here, this is kind of what I think the end frame can look like. So our initial view is going to be an empty beaker, and so we're going to explain how we get everything from here transitioning to here. Remember, for the interactive or for the animation of the storyboard, we need to be able to render out an animation that will simulate exactly what is happening in each of the storyboards. So in terms of the 3D elements, we're talking about an initial view, a transition to an end view. So three distinct elements we can think about: the first view, the end view, and the transition in between them. One important point that we need to talk about is the size of the render. So initially you're probably going to be faced with an 800 by 600 is the default size. And for our interactive module, we actually want this to be a 1024 by 768 window size. So we need to make sure that we've got 1024 by 768 dialed into the width and the height. And I have that set for the quick render and the nice render, which just adds ambient occlusion, refraction or reflection, and best for anti-aliasing. But for test renders, to keep things fast, we'll stick with the quick render. Okay, so now that we've made sure that we have 1024 by 768 set in, we can start looking at what we need to do to animate this transition. So to set up the initial view, what we need to do is make sure that the instruments are invisible. I'm just going to switch back to the perspective view so we don't inadvertently move our render cam when we're doing our tests here. So essentially what we want is these instruments invisible. And I've got materials here, and we have the steel material which is set to both the instruments. So if we look at the attributes, we can think about how we want to make these completely transparent. We have transparency here, which isn't enabled. So if we enable it, we can see that nothing seems to happen. What we need to do is bring the brightness up to 100 or to white and turn additive off. And sorry, the brightness is at 100%, the color is white, and additive is turned off. And notice that it's not, it looks as though it's a transparent object, but we still have these really bright highlights. So what we also need to do in the specular channel here is to bring the height all the way down to 0. And now you can see nothing in the preview. So we've got a completely transparent object. And if we do a little test render here, we can see that we basically have an empty beaker. Now one thing to note here is if you are using the nice settings where you're actually rendering out refraction, what you will notice, and I'll bring up a test render here, is that we've got the beaker, but we can actually see through the fluid. There's the refracted shapes of the instruments. So because this isn't a rendering tutorial, I'm going to just leave it up to you to figure out how to make that completely disappear if you like. So, but essentially we've got our instruments invisible. So that's halfway to our initial view. What we need to do is also change our camera angle, because as we remember from the storyboard, we have kind of a side view here. So let's go into our render cam, and in some ways it's more efficient to work backwards because we see that we've got our end view already with the render cam. So let's animate, or make sure that we maintain our end position of the camera. So there's a couple things we need to do with the animation before we get started with the keying, and that's to go into the project settings and change the I think it makes sense to change the frames per second down to 24, because this is just this isn't going to be a final piece. This is just an animation to show the functionality. So lower frames per second is fine. And let's change the time slider, since our transition will take place over 2 seconds. So let's change this down to 48. And I'm not sure why Cinema 4D starts at 1, but I'm comfortably starting at frame 1. So let's go from frame 1 to 48, and that's a full 2 seconds, 48 frames. So now that we've got the render cam, let's key the end position at frame 48. So make sure that the time slider is at frame 48, and then we can click on our render cam, and under the coordinates we can see that we've got the position, the scale, and the rotation. Now we only need to key the position and the rotation because the scale isn't going to change over our animation. So we can click on the P, and that highlights all the X, Y, and Z, and then control click or command click on a Mac, I think, and that causes these red dots to appear, and that signifies that we've got a key there. Now we want to do the same thing for the rotation, so let's click on the R for rotation and then control click, and we have red dots indicating keys. Now what happens if, so if we decide we want to move our camera somewhere else. And then if we go to frame 48, you'll notice that it snaps back to the position. So we've saved our end position. So now let's move our camera into our start position. So we'll go back to the initial frame for the start of our transition. And you'll notice sometimes the camera doesn't want to seem to respond too much with the tracking, and sometimes it helps just to click on an object and hit S, and that'll S is the shortcut for keying the selection, and that gives you a bit more freedom. It seems to change the orientation or pivot point of the camera a bit. Okay, so let's say perhaps that's a good start position. And remember, we've got the frame of our interactive module to think about. So we're going to have a button up here and a button down here and instruments in it. So I think that's a nice frame. We can do a little test render here. And that's maybe, that's not right. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out why it's rendering out as the first. You know what? Let's key it first. Okay, so let's bring our camera back to our start position, something like so. And you can see these are yellow, and that means that these attributes have changed. So we want to click on P, control click to key it, and you see they turn red. Click on R, control click, and red. So now we've got our frame 1 keyed and our frame 48 keyed, and you can see that it's animated the transition. So I'm just going to try again, take a little, there we go. So now we have a nice test render for our start position. I think that looks good. So let's take a look at this transition. Well, you notice that it looks okay, but partway through the transition we've got the beaker sort of coming out of frame, and that's not really ideal. So one thing that we can do is add an intermediate keyframe here. So on frame 24, let's add another frame. Let's move this down. Let's maybe move it back a little bit. Zoom out so we don't get too close. That'll give us a bit more freedom for a transition. So we've just centered it a little bit more. And so then let's key the rotation and the position one more time. So now we've got a transition where the beaker's in frame the entire transitional time. Okay, so that looks pretty good. You might notice that there's a bit of a sort of a jiggle or an unnatural movement over time. It's not too bad, but it's not entirely smooth. So what we can actually do is open up the timeline, and that'll give us a bit more control over the keys and how they're reacting over time. So we've got a render cam. We can dial that open and look at the position here, and we can actually dial each of these open too. And you notice we've got our start key on frame 1, our end key on frame 48, and our intermediate key on frame 24. And what we can do is we can click on the key and we get these control handles that pop up, and we can click on the ends of these and change how the value is being interpolated over time. So we want to kind of smooth this out. We can also click on the key, and if we shift drag, we can sort of smooth it out a bit for each of these. And we'll just play. Now you'll notice that in the background as we are removing these, this is actually moving our camera, the value that we've keyed. So we have to be careful that we don't make too drastic adjustments, but something like that. So let's just scrub through. And that's maybe a little better. You can play with it and get a better result. And notice that right here it's almost coming out of the frame. So maybe we can just take the, I think maybe the X position a little bit up, and maybe Z position, let's bring it down a little bit and maybe smooth that. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just get familiar with using the timeline to tweak your keys and the interpolation to get nice smooth curves. And you could add more keys if you want, but I think it makes sense to keep the keys few and tweak the interpolation with the tangent handles here.